The idea that back training can't get you in trouble, because that was the narrative that I was bought into. Yeah. It was just seen as this ultimate hedge. Like, no matter what your strength training program looks like, it will be as good or better if you just throw in more posterior chain work. Can't go wrong, right? Strong back. But then you get all these people where like their lats have squeezed all the air out of the back of their ribcage, and then they have absolutely no ability to rotate because they can't expand either side of the back of their ribcage. They cannot get their arms above their head because, again, you need air in the back of the ribcage to give your lats a fulcrum to lengthen over. You can get yourself into a lot of bother.
That was Angus Bradley, and you're listening to the Just Fly Performance Podcast. If you're curious what one of my top 5 paradigm shifts has been in training and performance the last few years, one answer of those might surprise you. One of those shifts has been moving to herbalism and herbal supplementation as an important part of my total health and performance regimen. You could say I got into it much in the same way I got into perception and reaction-based agility work, instead of emphasizing canned, cone, and ladder-based agility work, or 505s, or pro agilities. And that was really through being open-minded and making a shift towards natural methods, organic methods, versus more manufactured methods and ideas. And after really years of drinking way too much caffeine, taking too much pre-workout, and seeing my ability to harness adrenaline suffer as a result, amongst other reasons, I gave herbalism a shot, and specifically through the herbs of Lost Empire herbs. I replaced all but creatine in my supplementation routine. From my first dosage of, there was the Phoenix formula, it was my first herb I used, I noticed substantial results immediately. I saw improvements in my strength and power outputs. And you'll see other coaches who also will recommend herbs for performance, things like Shilajit. And Logan Christopher, CEO of the company, calls what they do performance herbalism, which means they focus on herbs that are so potent and powerful, that means you feel a difference when you take them. This isn't like the ginkgo biloba, the low-grade herbs you're seeing in capsule form at the local drugstore. These are performance herbs. They're 100% natural with no additives, chemicals, or colorings, and you can get extensive information on each herb or formula you purchase there. Lost Empire Herbs offers a 365-day money-back guarantee, so you can get these herbs virtually risk-free. They're founded by 3 brothers interested in athletic performance, and I'm really happy to have Lost Empire Herbs as a sponsor of this show. So if you're interested in the product and some of the products specifically that I use in my own training and performance regimen, you can head to lostempireherbs.com/justfly to check out those herbs and get 15% off your purchase. So again, head on over to lostempireherbs.com/justfly for 15% off. All right, let's get on to the show. Welcome to another show. As we've talked about several shows in the past, and then this is also a big interest of mine, is how do we manage different athlete types, elastic or concentric, if you want to use those terms, in terms of how much weightlifting are we giving these athletes? How much are we loading these athletes? And beyond that question, it's important to ask, how are we loading them when we do choose to put load on these athletes? The second portion of that might be the thing that perhaps we don't think about quite as often when it comes to how we're moving athletes through the weight room experience in conjunction with everything else they're doing, whether we're working with track athletes, field athletes, court athletes, whatever we're doing. We want to give the athlete, one, just the optimal amount of loading, but 2, we want to make sure that we're not bringing up unnecessary compensations as a result of the lifting practices we're doing. We've had other guests talk about this type of principle, and that's why I'm really excited to have Angus Bradley on the show today. Angus is a strength coach and podcast host from Sydney, Australia. He co-hosts the High Performance Podcast with his brother Oscar. And after focusing primarily on weightlifting for the first half of his career, Angus now finds himself spending much time outside of his lane and trying to identify the principles that really transcend all human movement, trying to find those master keys that define movement across multiple disciplines. Like many guests on the show, Angus has been well educated in the compression and expansion training ideals proliferated by Bill Hartman that are absolutely pushing our industry forward. Angus is frequently sharing next level knowledge from his social media platform and his podcast, and he personally works as a coach with a diverse crowd, from strongman to surfing and everything in between. On the show today, Angus is going to talk about squatting and hinging from a ribcage and pelvic floor perspective in terms of how shape change can occur when we load athletes a particular way, as well as unwanted shape changes and compensations within the body, and especially where elastic type athletes or narrow infrasternal angle athletes are going to be very prone to. So again, we tend to be working with a lot of athlete population. We as coaches work with oftentimes more than one type of athlete population. And so this is really important stuff. He's going to talk about how we can load and train these athletes who are more elastic with a narrow rib angle versus more muscular driven athletes who tend to have a wider infrasternal angle, and what that means in terms of putting load on the athlete, compressing the athlete. What nuances are we looking for in the lift itself? What are we looking for when basically we see that the lift, they're getting stronger in a lifting program, but now it's not because muscles are getting more powerful. It's just because maybe they're changing the shape of their body to hit the lift. Angus is just brilliant with this stuff. He had a lot of points as well as it pertains to me and my own training and my own athletic type. So obviously I enjoyed this podcast a ton because I learned a lot about myself. But anyways, this is one of those shows that I wish I would have listened to myself 15 years ago, and it was really enjoyable talking to Angus about all things lifting, compensation patterns, pressures, shape change, and a lot of other knowledge that you'll find really helpful and important. All right, with that said, let's get on to episode 249 with Angus Bradley. All right, Angus, it's awesome to have you, man. Before we get started, I have a question for you, and that's, all like the Instagram pictures and the artwork for your podcast. Like, how do you guys come up with that stuff? If anyone's seen your podcast, High Performance, how do you guys come up with the different pictures for the week or the guest?
That's all Oscar, my brother. So I don't know. We like to dive into serious topics and things like that, but we like to sort of go there in a really casual and I guess maybe a little bit of a humorous way. And we've always sort of just enjoyed, we grew up playing Grand Theft Auto, Vice City and all those games. And I think there was a bit of a Miami Vice sort of theme come back in like the online space. A lot of people getting back into fluoro and that sort of a vibe. So it's just Oscar, and we just commissioned an artist and we're like, how do you sort of see us? And then that's what we got sent back. And then it was just two dudes with their shirts off, and we're like, can you put some girls in the background? And he was like, yeah, sure. And then that's sort of how we ended up with the thing.
I mean, yeah, I feel like I'm boring. I just have the same banner, just guests, same text. You guys always have like a different piece of art for the different guests and stuff. I always love that. We try
to pride ourselves on our irreverence. Like, I think one of the things that always annoyed me about the fitness industry is people have always had that survivorship bias of like, you've got to spend a certain amount of time in the industry. You've got to be respectful. You've got to wait in line to ask questions and stuff like that. And we feel like we can just tear down the walls a little bit quicker if we're like, nah, this whole thing's like, it's a bit of a joke, really. It's just like a bit of sport and that, like, let's just sort of break down some of those barriers, not take ourselves so seriously.
Yeah, I agree. I really appreciate the humor that humor and irreverence in what you guys are doing. It's needed, especially when there's so many. I'm sure we're gonna get to on the show today, or like we were talking about before, like things like the posterior chain. Like you got to get, and just there. It's almost like everything or. Darian Barr, my track mentor, said to me, like, everything your track coach told you to do, just do the opposite. Like, and so I'm not saying it's like that for everything in fitness, but I think there's so many things we just don't know yet. It's nice to have a humorous attitude with it.
And especially because, like, we always get told to not be emotional and to not take things personally. But I think we do because, we think of those ideas as our own and stuff like that. And it helps a lot have some of these tougher conversations if you can just be a bit more humorous about it. Otherwise, it does feel really serious when you're like, you're using your body the wrong way. Like, that's a gnarly conversation. So we can have a bit of a joke about it. It just helps, like, it eliminates some of that extra baggage that makes these things extra uncomfortable.
Yeah, and maybe that would be a good segue to the first question, because I've thought about this a lot. I've heard people say all the time in sports performance or strength and conditioning, with young athletes, the foundation of athletic development or something linking to this is being able to squat, hinge, push, pull. We all need to do these things. And so something about that, I mean, I'm like, all right, can you sprint? Can you jump? Like, can you crawl? Can you swing, climb? All these, I feel like these skills are really more. But anyways, I had a post myself on Instagram where I was kind of had my own version of, I'm like, well, maybe there's more pronation, supination, but I wouldn't actually even agree with my own post necessarily. But anyways, I'm curious what your take is on the idea of squat, hinge, pushing, pulling, these being foundational core movements of athletic performance? And if not, how do we look at it all?
Yeah. So I think because people, when we use the term like a squat or a hinge or a push or a pull, we're trying to categorize human movement. And there's an implication that if you're doing a squat, you're training a certain muscular strategy. And if you're training a hinge, it is a different muscular strategy. But I think due to just like, you know, the S&C world has always sort of looked to powerlifting and been like, well, you are the squat guys. Can you tell us how to squat? But the thing like that is like, the idea of a squat for a powerlifter is like, is the barbell on your back? Like that's all a squat is to them. Whereas in the S&C world, the squat is, and it's like when the bar's on your back, it doesn't matter what sort of a muscular strategy you use. It's just about going down, breaking parallel, and then coming back up. But there's a certain sort of quality that we're trying to capture as an S&C coach when we prescribe a squat or a hinge, and to the point where it's no longer about like where the bar is on your body, but it's just like, what is the muscular strategy, at least in my eyes, like at the thorax and at the pelvis, versus using squat, hinge, push, pull. It's sort of more indicative of what's going on at the limbs. And it's not that that's not important, but I think you want to look at the strategy most proximally. Like that's the biggest influence on human movement, controlling your center of mass. That's how we end up moving our limbs through space most effectively. So, and just to like really put it clearly, like the two different opposing strategies as I see them when it comes to the thorax and the pelvis is it doesn't squat. Like the thorax doesn't squat. It doesn't hinge. It just compresses, goes in and expands. So it exhales and it inhales is, I guess, like the easiest way to visualize that compression and expansion. But compression and expansion, it doesn't always mean breathing, because obviously you can feel an exhalation strategy, but then have your mouth closed. Like we would still consider that like an exhalation movement. But it's just like a nice idea of like something you can connect to those strategies. Does that make sense? Because we'll go into after it how a particular way of coaching the squat can make it all the same strategy as your hinge.
Yeah, I mean, I know where you're heading, and I think when we do get into this stuff regarding to like the pressure, the thorax, inhaled and exhaled, I've had a lot of guests on talking about this, and sometimes I get confused, so I'll let you know. But from what my understanding is, more so than thinking of the squat as we think of like a powerlifter squat, we're thinking of what's happening in the squat pattern, maybe on the level of the thorax. Exactly. So really,
we're trying to eliminate redundancy in the training protocol. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, so it's maybe from a basic level. And a plus two, I think it could be triggering to a lot of people like, oh, what do you mean you don't want to squat? What do you mean you don't want to hinge? But you're saying more it's a squat pattern, hinge pattern, but that doesn't mean that the bar is in a certain location. It just means this is what's happening to the thorax and the pelvis on this level.
So let's get a working definition of the squat and the hinge, because I think you've had Pat Davidson on, and I'm a real big fan of his squatty squats and hingey hinges concept. Where I'm not a fan of it is he has not made an effort to come up with language that the community is going to accept, because people are so attached to the way that they squat that they think that Pat's trying to change the way they squat. And it's like, no, he's just calling what you do as a squat a deadlift. Like you can keep doing it that way because that's successful in your competition. But in his model, it's like, it's not different enough from a hinge to actually call it a squat. So in this whole compression expansion model, obviously it's Phil's model, but then Pat is the one who's been talking about these squatty squats. What we look at a squat as is just pure vertical translation of a pelvis. Pelvis just dropping straight down in space. And there may be deviations from that because usually our limbs move in arcs, but just the dominant movement is definitely just vertical down. And then the hinge, it is pushing the pelvis back horizontally in a straight line. So now we have a much more clear definition of what these things look like, at least on a surface level. And now how does that strategy then differ between a squatty squat and a hingey hinge from a pressure management strategy? So in a squat, to get your pelvis to start at the top in relatively full hip extension and descend all the way to parallel and then all the way down onto your ankles, the majority of time throughout that movement, as you're heading down, the pelvis is going to be increasing in volume. But the entire thorax will be inhaling. Pelvic floor will be descending, creating a lot of space in that pelvic bowl for the abdominal viscera to come down. And this is where it gets murky, right? Because when you reach parallel in that squat, that's when the femurs are about as IR'd as they're going to get in the squat. So you actually, midway through that squat, the pelvic floor does have a yielding action and ascends a little bit. If you can control it, you'll see a lot of real expanded people just free fall through that zone. Do you know the people I'm talking about? And then once they get to the bottom, they're back into that expansion strategy. And you'll notice a lot of springy people, they're really comfortable hanging out there. They'll have to sort of bounce and compress their way out of there. Like they'll have to develop a bit of compression, sort of doing that. And now let's talk about the hinge. Oh, sorry, just one last thing on the squat. The squat being an expansion dominant strategy, we talk about like a big emphasis on that eccentric component. It has a big counter movement. So all sort of counter movements are things that we describe as expansive expansion strategy in nature. The hinge is just the opposite. So the most stereotypical hinge we can think of is just like a conventional deadlift starting from the floor. So we have no counter movement. It is a purely compression action, and all you are doing is just extending your hips from there. You're just increasing pressure and decreasing space in the pelvis and the thorax. So it is a pure compression movement. We have the opposite strategy of the ribcage, the pelvic floor, and like the thoracic diaphragm. And now what you're probably realizing now that we've just given a kind of a clear definition of what a squat or what an expansion strategy looks like at the pelvis and the thorax, and then what a hinge strategy looks like at the pelvis and the thorax, you can see that a lot of the ways we coach different squat variations, they're actually like a mishmash of all these compression and expansion strategies. And like, so I've just said that a hinge or a conventional deadlift is this pure compression strategy, but if I take throw a bunch of expansion concepts on top of that, like say I get you in a trap bar deadlift, so I've just ER'd your arms and things like that. And if I make it like a touch and go deadlift, so we have a big yielding moment beforehand, we just tap on the ground and then we compress off. I've taken this pure compression strategy and I've layered a bunch of expansion strategies in there. Same as the squat. And now this is what powerlifters have done to a squat, because you can imagine like powerlifters, we all know that they're terrible at yielding, like they're just stiff as bricks. So they've taken their squat and they've taken as much ER out of it as possible, and they've tried to distill it just to those sort of IR qualities as much as they can, while still adhering to the rules of their squat. Like they still have to break parallel, so their hips can't move just back, their hips have to move a little bit down. But you'll notice that powerlifters in their squat, their hips are moving more back than down. They are spending more time trying to create compression and decrease volume in the thorax and the pelvis so that they don't just fall straight to the ground, because that would be the worst thing ever for them.
Yeah. What do you think about this? So hopefully we'll unpack that a little bit as we go along. Actually, before I ask you this question, could you just give me a quick, you mentioned athletes who are compressed and expanded, and I know that'll be something I imagine you touch on quite a bit. So before we get too much further, just a quick definition on someone who is a compressed presentation versus an expanded presentation.
So the easiest way to see it is like, have you heard of the whole infrasternal angle thing?
Yeah, and Kyle Dobbs just mentioned it on a couple podcasts ago, so everyone hopefully who listened to that maybe heard it, but I definitely going through it again would be great, because I know a lot of people
and it kind of can be like the biggest thing ever, but it's also then it's kind of like soma types. Like it kind of is like what you are is what you are. And like eventually you'll get to the point where you probably don't need to actually measure infrasternal angles, because the stereotypes are so clear. It's pretty hard to get fooled. So like a big power lifter, like your stereotypical power lifter walks like a fridge, does a lot of bench press, does a lot of squats, does a lot of deadlifts. They're up just below their sternum where their ribs come apart, all those false ribs and stuff like that. They will be, I've heard a few different numbers as far as like what's neutral or what's considered like not a wide and not a narrow ISA, but let's say beyond 90 degrees. I've also heard 108.8 degrees because that's 2 helixes. But most of these people are like quite wide. And those people will be compressed anterior to posterior. And then you've got your narrow infrasternal angles, and they're just the opposite. Their false ribs are really close together. And we call those people expanded anterior to posterior. And typically these will be like people who have a lot of movement options, people who are very floppy, like girls who are like ballerinas and things like that. Like they strike me as your typical narrows, all your jumping athletes and stuff like that.
Right here, hand raised.
Yeah. You are just looking at you, you know that you're a narrow. But then every now and then, like females, if they have a baby and it like sits really high in their thorax, that can sort of open up their ribs. So you do get some females who are like, oh, you've got to be a narrow. But then after they have a kid, they are turned into this wide by the baby. And like these things are strategic evolutions or sort of developments. Like I guess a modern example would be like a linebacker, right? Or like what is in the NFL, the guys who are sort of at the line of scrimmage.
Lineman,
They don't want to be rotated easily, right? So for them, not having movement options and being ultra compressed anterior to posterior, it makes them harder to rotate and shift out of the way. So for those people, the compression strategy suits them. And then for like, someone who needs to bend and rotate, if you have a thorax that's shaped like a sausage, it's just a shape that rotates really well. But if you expand a linebacker too much, maybe you could give that guy too many movement options. So it kind of depends what you're trying to do. There's also some great research on this. I think it's torso integration theory or something like that. It's a paper I heard Zach Couples mention, and he sort of talks about these two different axial skeleton shapes. It's whether you're a wide or a narrow kind of is dependent on the climate of your ancestors, or that's like a really big factor. So that compressed axial skeleton shape is a really, really good shape for maintaining heat. And it's a really bad shape for sort of dispersing heat. So a lot of people who live in those Arctic climates and things like that often have more compressed skeletons, whereas like versus your sub-Saharan Africans who need to have that expanded sort of shape, which has a high surface area, I think. So it's a bit better for dispersing heat and things like that. So I think when people hear compression, they think, ooh, bad. And then expansion might be good, or maybe people have less emotional attachments to those words. But I think that's one of the biggest issues with communicating all this stuff. People always say like, oh, you're just compressed as a bad thing. It's just like, no, it's just a thing. It's helped people survive cold climates. It's helped linebackers do their job. It's just whether or not you need more of those linebacker Eskimo qualities, or do we need more of these sub-Saharan bendy Joel qualities in this person? And then developing, obviously, our strength training protocol, because a lot of people, you hear athletes being like, oh, like, I used to have this really springy athlete. I used to feel really springy. And then I started lifting heavy weights and I became more compressed, or they don't necessarily say it like that. They'll say, I lost my spring. Whereas, my thinking is that if we start to strip away some of these, let's call them accidental compression strategies that we've been layering on our supposed expansion strategies that we've been meaning to chase the whole time, we will not have these unintentional negative effects on athletic performance in certain athlete groups.
Yeah, I love that you mentioned, like with the ISA too. I was on Jake Tura, who has a podcast, Jacked Athlete, a lot of vertical jump. We talk vertical jump, and with Jake had said he notices a lot of those good jumpers were narrow infrasternal angles. And I remember when I think he asked me about it. I was like, yeah, I think you're about right. But the more I thought about that after the show, I'm like, yeah. Like
they're expanded. They're like a soccer ball that's ready to bounce off the ground versus your wide ISAs. If you squeezed all the air out of a soccer ball and threw it at the ground, it wouldn't it's going to
That's a good analogy for that, actually. Like if I have a narrow ISA, I basically have a blown up soccer ball in my ribs.
You're inflated.
That can
you're
bounce.
ready to bounce.
Yeah. And if I
That's
don't
how
have
I view
supination
and pronation as well. Like supination is the inflated ball, and pronation is that ball as it's smushing into the ground. Because I think that's a hard strategy to view as a compressive strategy, because pronation feels like such a stretch at the bottom of the foot. But that's actually our body when it's driving hardest into the ground.
Interesting. I've one of the things that Darian Barr, this is like one of the things that I never actually got to work with him in person and like check out, but he had a device that almost allowed him to like pump up his inhalation more. Like it was like a little respiratory device where he carried more air as he was, doing whatever. And he was like deadlifting with it and deadlifting massive weight, which that makes sense with the deadlift, I guess, if it's the I guess usually people are better pullers who have or deadlifters who have the narrow ISA versus.
Well, they got air to squeeze out of them.
Gotcha. So the more air you have, the more that you can I'm at loss for the exact mechanisms because I would plug into lifts and jumps, but generally in that pulling action, you have more air. You need more air in the pull when your hips are back versus a squat. You don't need as much. Yeah.
So the pull off the ground, it's still a relatively exhaled position. Like hip flexion is regarded as an inhalation strategy. But then when you're in about that sort of 90 degrees of hip flexion, that's when the pelvic floor has started to reascend there. So you're in a little bit of a relatively inhaled position in an overall exhalation strategy there. So that's why people will sort of stand up, get their air in there, and then go down into that position. Because even though we're in hip flexion, it's still a position where we're going to have a nutated sacrum and the guts are going to be trying to ascend. And you feel it when you deadlift, right? Air just wants to come out of your mouth as soon as you deadlift. Pat Davis always talks about, you never hear tennis players inhale as they hit the ball with the racket. And it's the same in the deadlift. You're never going to hear anyone be off the floor in a deadlift. You would just fold.
It is pretty funny how little we think about that quality, because anyone who goes down to deadlift, try inhaling all your hair first or something and then doing it.
Versus inhale as you're going down into a squat, and it's perfect. Exhaling before you go into the squat is helpful, but then as you're descending, inhaling can really facilitate those hip flexion mechanics by expanding the pelvis, driving the guts down into them and opening that thing up.
So does that differ now than a powerlifter squat? Because they hinge the squat more, and so they wouldn't want to do it probably, right? Okay, cool. Now,
and they will go down, and like I said, so it's generally an inhalation strategy, but they've put the bar down lower on their back, so they're gonna hinge forward more, which is a little bit compressive, and they're just gonna go down. So we've talked about how the full range of a squat, you have the pelvic floor descends, the pelvis expands, and then when you're halfway down, that's the hardest point of the squat. So the body starts to ascend that pelvic floor to give you some compression to help you manage the pressure. The powerlifters really, really tap into that. They don't want to go beyond that. They just want to increase that pressure. As soon as the pressure's as much as they can, that's when they turn it around. Whereas to make it a yielding action, which is what we want for our athletes who want movement options, who want to focus on these yielding strategies, they will need to then inhale. I say that in inverted commas because it doesn't actually have to involve sucking more air in. It can just be you relaxing into it, letting the pelvic floor yield, and then you back down the bottom. And then you can focus on training your overcoming strategies from that. The same way sometimes you do jumps with a counter movement, and some days you just want to do a more of a compression strategy. You take away their counter movements. Got it.
So this leads me to, and I think I've talked with Justin more about this, at least idea. So if I'm getting better at, because I want to talk about the idea of when we get better at these things, what happens? Meaning, I think a lot of people are just just get your squat up because a good athlete squats XYZ relative to body weight. And I think that's, again, where I don't like and I would agree with you. I think the thing that doesn't resonate is athletes have to squat, they have to hinge. You think about all the lifts that the strength coach personally and emotionally is attached to is the variations the athlete gets rather than is what's actually happening with that canister, what's happening with the pelvis.
Are they the PRs all come from the compression?
The what comes from the compression?
The personal records in the lifts all come from the compression strategies. At no point do you put 3 times body weight on your athlete's back and just write it down to the safeties.
Oh, yeah.
I just want to see how much you can yield with. And I'm not even saying that that's what we should do, but we just have to acknowledge that we're going to be really attracted to these compression strategies because they give us these big, sexy numbers on the bar. But maybe you need to not worry about what kind of squat that your athlete can grind out just getting to parallel, but what kind of squat can your athlete absolutely sink, bounce their butt off their ankles and with a real nice looking yielding strategy, and then fly through that compression zone back up to expansion, not get pinned in that compression zone in the middle, sort of where they all really slow down, those bouncy people around parallel, trying to reascend that pelvic floor. Because that's just them trying to throw their guts back up off the pelvic floor so they can create compression. Whereas you'll notice people who can't do that, they'll just lean forward to unload their pelvic floor and then hinge their way out of there. Because like I said, leaning forward gets the weight of your guts off that pelvic floor and makes it easier to sort of drive that exhalation strategy.
Yeah, and
that's why falling forward is efficient propulsion. It's just you don't want to do that in a squatty context because we're not practicing falling forward there.
And that's where what you just said, I think, explains really well what I've seen is that athletes, when they first start lifting, they're usually going to get like performance gain. As long as their form is good, they're just kind of learning the technique. They're not trying to crush numbers. They're going to get a gain out of that for a little while. And then there's this point where it's like their gains start to slow down. And they start being like, oh, I got to still PR. I got to still lift more weight. Well, at that point, now what happens to lift more weight? Because you aren't engaging more, I guess specific. There's a lot of things happening, right? But the way I see it, okay, you're in a good position. You're engaging some specific motor units. You're getting a large, global output. Cool. But then like you hit that point and now to PR, you got to do something else. And that's where I feel like you start to see those compression strategies and unnecessary strategies really layer on themselves over time.
Yeah. And I think that's what you're witnessing when you see those awesome results from a good strength training program is you're seeing the benefit of that athlete increasing their ability to compress without changing their starting point to someone who is generally more compressed. Because it's the laying down of more muscle tissue over time. Like that is compressive in nature. Even if you're doing an expansion strategy, just adding load to anything makes it more relatively compressive. And there's just a point where it's not you being like adapting in this program, you've adapted to that compressive load.
To the
and
weight.
That's what we're trying to avoid.
Yeah, exactly. To the bar crushing you.
Just sprinkle in the compression, but largely just really trying to increase the amount of stress that we can yield under, which is kind of, it sounds like an oxymoron because we're trying to like increase our ability to compress while still maintaining our expansion. But like, and that's why it is challenging because you're chasing this paradox. But I think that is sort of athletic. That really speaks to the problems that we all face in athletic development, right? There's so many of these little contradictions that we're all trying to live in the Goldilocks zone of.
I wanted to take a quick break from the show to talk to you about 2 units that Simply Faster now has out that are excellent for training data collection in measuring bar speeds, sprint metrics, limb speeds, and more. The first is the VMAX Pro. If you're interested in barbell tracking technology that is affordable for the individual athlete in the garage gym, but yet is accurate enough to be trusted by professional teams, then you might be interested in the VMAX Pro. The VMAX Pro is a tiny sensor that attaches to the barbell or even the body to help with lifting and jump training metrics. It'll give you immediate feedback for jumps, lifts, and even measure the motion of the bar in 3D. It includes a travel pouch, and the associated app works on both Android and iOS devices. You can auto-regulate with precision with the VMAX Pro. The second unit is the Muscle Lab IMU. If you want to take your movement training to the next level, then the IMU is something you would definitely want to look into, as it's a pocket-sized sensor that can attach anywhere on the body and deliver research-grade motion real time. With it, you can collect ground contact times during sprints, limb speeds for jumping and throwing, and even support return-to-play metrics. The sensor fuses with the rest of the Muscle Lab sensor system for even deeper insights. You can improve your movement data and get measurement that matters today with the Muscle Lab IMU unit. You can improve the depth of your workout metrics with these 2 pieces of technology. And if you're interested, you can head on over to simplyfaster.com. That's simply with an I, faster.com. Check out their online store where you can find these pieces and improve the depth of your training metrics today. Let's get on back to the show. Yeah, I feel like there is a lot going on. I think about, I got to this point in my early 20s, mid 20s. It took me a while, a little trial and error to figure this out and like I'll go back to it simplistic, but you'll hear, oh man. And I had a lot of my elite like sprinters and jumpers got up to a 2 times bodyweight squat actually pretty quick and easily. And then I'm sitting here like, man, how come I can't? And so what I kind of realize is like, look, like, an athlete with a 500 horsepower engine is going to be able to do 500 horsepower engine things without compressing themselves unnecessarily to get that. Versus if me personally, I'm going to try to squat that weight, I'm going to have to manipulate the heck out of my skeleton to get to what that outcome goal would be.
You don't seem like you've got good leverage for compressing your thorax. So like your knees come in a lot when you squat heavy, right?
Oh yeah.
So you probably find more IR distally because you're so bad at getting it proximally. Like you probably really struggle to ascend a diaphragm like really hard and aggressively, or like maintain that overcoming action. So I reckon probably what gives you a bit of momentum to ascend your pelvic floor is the fact that you're so good at IR and pronation distally, and then that starts that from the ground up, driving all your guts up and things like that. I could be completely wrong also, but that would be my guess.
You're probably right. I mean, I would take a little bit to unpack for me to understand like all the little, I get what you're saying. I
think the shin angles is going to be a good way of explaining the squat for you to like really connect it with sort of how you view compression and expansion maybe.
Yeah.
Sorry, I cut you off there.
Yeah, no, that sounds good. I mean, maybe we could use me as an example. That's fine. I definitely, it helps me to learn, and I think I can also carry a good conversation based off some of these topics that I think are, because I know we have a lot of terms here, and so I want to keep them, like, I want to keep it pretty, as soon as I start, I want to make sure I don't get confused first and foremost.
For people who aren't indoctrinated, there's nothing worse than, like, with these new systems, the language, and it's an unfortunate part of it, because I know people just love to make up terms for the sake of making up terms. That's always the thing that gets me with the, like, once I have the terms, I'm good, but I'm actually a slow learner with terms and stuff like that for whatever reason, like new terms and different languages as well. But, excuse me. But I like, you're just self-aware. I think we're all slow learners. Some people just think we're fast learners.
Yeah. For me, like, I'm actually, it's funny because I was a high jumper, but I actually have kind of a longer torso and short femurs and long shins. It's a very weird scenario.
That's brilliant.
And so I actually look like a swimmer, and I don't, but somehow I was a good high jumper. I do have a narrow ISA. I was always a better deadlifter. When I did have a short, like, powerlifting kind of training stint in my early 30s, my deadlift was actually my best lift. I deadlifted 405, which is okay. It's not great, but my squat was only like 330 or 335 with short femurs. Like, if you would look at me from the outside, you would say, oh, this guy should be a better squatter. But I mean, I could just pull. Like, pulling is so easy, and I never really knew why. So it's, the exhaled in the diaphragm.
You're not, see, and that's the thing. You say you're not a good squatter. I say you're not a strong squatter, because you're a good squatter how I define a squat, which is your ability to yield. Does that sort of make sense?
Yeah.
It's like you have a real nice squat because you're not too compressed, but like we just said, in that traditional weight room view of what a good squat is, whereas it's just viewed as how much can you stand back up with again, it is viewed as a bad squat. But I don't know if you agree with this. I would say your ability to yield is your strength as an athlete. So it kind of makes sense. It's like, because no offense either, like 180 for someone who's jumps as high as you, I would say is not a great deadlift. You know what I mean? So it's
terrible.
From an ability to leverage a compression strategy, you're better at leveraging compression in a hinge context. But I look at you, and your skeleton to me makes you a better squatter in the sense that we're talking about an ability to expand a thorax than deadlifter.
Yeah, and so I guess I like what you said with you're a good squatter, but you're not a strong squatter. And because I guess I look at that in the sense that my best, when I did high jump, the year I high jumped my PR 7 feet or 214, the next year I actually got better at squatting. Like my squat was up, like, and I didn't do as well. And it was actually like a slower contact. It was just, there was some other stuff that season, but I was a different athlete fundamentally that year. And so, I mean, for what that's worth.
You say you had a longer ground contact.
Yeah, just every step was a little bit, I feel like, longer on the ground. Like, it wasn't quite like the bouncing ball.
And what I see that is you've expanded more. Like, because I see expansion as something that increases ground contact time. Because when we hit on the heels, like, that's very expansive. You've got more time to push force into that ground. Versus if you are more compressed, you're naturally going to hit more on the ball of your foot, and you're going to get through that whole foot roll sort of a lot quicker. It's going to be a more sort of compression-based jump. Just going back to your deadlift, though, like, are you the kind of person where when you fail a deadlift, it just stays glued to the floor?
Yes, basically. Or 1 inch, or maybe like a half inch off the ground. But yeah, that.
And because exactly, that's what it is in that position. That's where you've got to be able to compress, and like, because that's the thing that you struggle with. Whereas for you, once you get it off the ground and you're moving, like, you're sweet, right?
Mm-hmm. Oh, easy. Yeah.
Because your body just lives off momentum.
Yep, I'm Elastic City. Yep, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And that's on it, because I hear you and Jake, or guys like you and Jake, talk about like more muscular jumpers, and like I guess that's that sort of like wide maybe strategy.
Yeah, I've actually started to realize this recently as in a running two-leg jump. So, which is it's more rotational than people think. Like basically one leg comes down and then it's usually the right leg, and then the left leg, which is more the stiffer like leg, I think due to our, anatomy with the heart on one side and whatnot, is usually that leg usually rotates around like almost like a barn door swinging around. And I found that people who are compressed A to P, like I literally just figured this out. It took me however many years, but those compressed A to P people can't do that skill. They have to jump off one leg, or they do like a two-leg jump. Yeah, they do a two-leg jump stop.
Yeah.
It's hilarious. And I've been trying to for the longest time, I'm trying to coach people into this. And I think if you watch like a lot of elite jumpers, I think there's even some high-level jumpers that almost have like a jump stop type motion. And it's probably due to whatever their spinal ribcage restrictions were not. I mean, maybe there's some other things going on there too, but I don't know, it's just interesting to start to think about how someone's technique evolves based off of your compression. Can you rotate based off your rib cage and stuff like that? And usually the body's doing the best it can given what it has in front of it or what it can feel. So,
well, and that's it. I think the two strategies I see, like to look at it just from a pelvic floor perspective. Like that's just a trampoline for your guts, and like your guts probably weighs like a good 20 kilos, I imagine. And some people just have that constant overcoming exhalation compression strategy at the pelvic floor. So like the little yield that it does have when they push down into the ground, then it just springs off quickly, versus some people are really good at accepting their guts into expanding that pelvic floor. They really get that big stretch of the trampoline, and that's what they leverage to then spring their guts up and sort of start driving that momentum.
Got it.
Because that's what sort of makes sense to me. When you see athletes wind up in their counter movement to test their vert, and they snap their arms down, and then just as they're about to turn around, their knees come in. Yes. And that sort of IR adduction. So if we think about what those movements are doing up the chain, that will be ascending your pelvic floor when you drive those knees in. So you driving your knees in, that stops you from going down because it's turned your guts around. Your guts have turned around inside you already. And then behind that, you come up sort of with the hip extension and sort of follow through from that. And that's sort of, in my eyes, I see a lot of good athletes, good yielding athletes sort of taking advantage of that strategy. Or that's what I think I'm seeing anyway.
Yeah, so that's Pat. When Pat Davidson was on my podcast a while ago, he was talking about that. So with me, I'm always like the experimental, figure for these things. But when I was squatting in high school, naturally my squat, our coach didn't coach us. It was just, here's a bar and go, do some squats. And I was squatting, again, not a lot of weight, mid 200s, but when I started to get heavy, when the bar started to get heavy, I noticed that my knees would really start coming in, and I would go to the balls of my feet, knees in, to get to about parallel, I guess, probably parallel.
Yeah.
And I don't know, but it was actually, I remember I was jumping well, my 2-foot vertical was actually going pretty good. And then when I stopped squatting, my 1 foot came up. But then I remember in my mid 20s, I decided to squat the official NSCA way or whatever was in the book, and I put my knees out and I pushed through my heels. I don't think that said push through heels in the book.
Like a good boy.
Like a good boy was supposed to. Yeah. And then I noticed that I started to not get the transfer that I did earlier on. And then Pat was saying the knees in actually it's fits with the strategy maybe I'm already using in jumping, which is to pinch off the pelvic floor so the guts can bounce.
Absolutely.
Off of it.
It's so proximal, and there's so much pressure that's being handled in there. I really do think that everything else from the limbs comes secondary. It really is just about managing all the pressure in here. I think from a sensory perspective, our feet are extraordinarily important. So I'm not 100% all in on proximal to distal, but especially the pelvic floor. I think people are sold on breathing, people are sold on the diaphragm and things like that, but I think the pelvic floor is something we only look at when athletes are peeing their pants. And I just, or just for females, it's sort of seen as something that's important, but I just think it's going to be the new thing that once people start actually looking at this thing and how it works, a trampoline for your guts, that's huge. To me, anyway.
Oh yeah, the highest jumpers have. I mean, if you don't have a trampoline, you got to use something else. Like, and it's not going to be as fast off the ground. So,
and I think not being able to see it is what scares a lot of people off, or I think men in general, like the strength conditioning industry is dominated by males. So I think they feel weird talking about pelvic floor stuff. But now that we're becoming so much more educated about the diaphragm, the benefit of all this stuff is like there's such a reciprocal relationship between the pelvic floor, or the pelvic diaphragm, as some people call it, and the thoracic diaphragm, that you can make a lot of really good assumptions of what's going on at the pelvic floor based off what you see at the ribcage.
Yeah. So, and based off,
and then also at the foot. Sorry.
Yeah. So based off of like the idea of the squat pattern and the hinge pattern, and then what we just talked about in the sense of getting strong, working until you find that point that an athlete is just layering on compression to get better. What's your take on, let's say I want to jump higher and I don't use a lot of knee bend when I jump, and I'm in the weight room, and how are you looking at me in light of those two strategies? The pelvis descending straight down versus hips back, and what the pelvic floor obviously needs to do, which is a rebounding. What are your thoughts on how I would manage that in the weight room setting?
Okay, so it depends on like what you are versus what you've tried to turn yourself into, in my opinion, because we've discussed how both strategies can work. And I think for most people, you just want to find not what they've tried to turn themselves into, but what they were meant to be from the get-go. So say I've got you, right? And you're like, I've lost my spring. And if I look at you, most people, when they're compensated, always go proximal, and like you'll probably seem a bit more posteriorly compressed. And I'm looking at this guy, Joel, and I'm like, he's told me he's always been like a springy guy. He's never been a weight room hero. I'm looking at his skeleton is telling me the same story, that this is a guy who just thrives off rotation, expansion, movement options, yielding strategies. I'm going to push you back into those yielding strategies. And I'm going to be very, very careful about the amount of load I put on you, because as soon as I put load on you, you're not going to be able to handle it, and you're instantly going to like over compress and probably compress parts of your body that we're not trying to compress, like trying to compress your pelvis, like hip extension, whereas you probably just compress your back, or like something that you've managed to get really strong or something like that. And then looking at Jake Tura, I don't know if he's a bit of a muscular guy. I'm not sure that he probably is a wide infrasternal angle. So someone like him, you may benefit to an extent from doubling down on those compression strategies, right? It is someone who is designed to compress, letting compress. It's more there where you just, every now and then you'll notice those people go too far. They push themselves too far, and you sprinkle in a little expansion just to pull them back and be like, I need to give you something to compress. So for an expansion person, just trying to drive, honestly, as much expansion as possible. If they seem like really weak or undersized, yes, you are going to have to entertain more compressive strategies. But even in the long run, like you can build a lot of strength with these expansion strategies. It's just that they more promote yielding. But like I said, if you're moving weight, that's still compressive in nature. So like I said, it's all relative. Does that seem... Am I speaking clearly? So sometimes I ramble on a few tangents, but like acknowledge what they are, what direction they're heading in, and then act accordingly based off that.
Yeah. So basically, I have athletes come in. Let's say I have an athlete who wants to be fast. Now I'm a sprinter, or everyone wants to be faster, right? Like that's track, whatever. And they're a narrow ISA. And they're expanded person, so they're like just more naturally bouncy. And I think this fits with a lot of like prior guests. Hey, you have a muscular sprinter, an elastic sprinter, this sprinter, and the elastic sprinters tend to do better with more plyometrics and bouncy stuff and rhythmic running and less weightlifting. And so it's almost like this is where this meets too. It's like, hey, if I don't know what someone is, I could just start by measuring their infrasternal angle too, and say, hey, like what so. What you're saying is, so someone like me, and I will say this too, is one of the best training years I had was in my mid-20s, and I hurt my back being a dumbass with squats. Again, I was just trying to chase up my weak numbers, just trying to get that squat going. Yeah. Tweak my back in the lower right SI, or typical AIC stuff, right? And then I had to come back with it. Like I wanted to train. So I came back from that injury doing just like 505 tempos, 404 tempos, 204 tempos with like 95 pounds. So 40 kilos, like nothing.
Yeah. And relatively way more expansion dominant, way more yielding, like emphasize the yielding.
Yeah. And I come back and I set a 1-inch personal lifetime PR on standing vertical jump. It is standing vertical, so it's not like reactive, but I was like, oh, hell yeah. Like, and so it's like, I didn't touch more than 115 that last like month or whatever. But as I was reading, Pat's book and what you're saying, I'm like, it's like, you're not going to compress to lift that 95 pounds at 115. It's just, it's all
not nearly to the same degree.
No, it's just all yielding. But so that's where you work the yielding too. That's the interesting part that because of the things that you mentioned with me, I was aware that I'm more expanded elastic, but the yielding thing intrigues me, and I can rotate. I was a javelin thrower too. So the interesting, like my weird type of athlete I was. High jump,
and that's
javelin.
such an inhalation movement, like flexion, abduction, external rotation, and then having to run like that. Like
that was my jam.
The strategies that you're juggling there is insane.
Yeah,
only if you think about it.
No, I wasn't thinking about it at all. It's like, I just know I wish I was faster, but I can jump high, I can throw the javelin real far. So, but so what was I getting? Oh, but I said I could yield. And so another thing that I have done in my training that I have found helpful, and it's like Dan John actually said this on a podcast a long time ago on this show. It basically said, if you're not built to squat, basically probably neuro ISA, he said don't do generally probably don't try to go under sets of 10 and squat because you'll do too much weight and you will over compress to try to get the weight. And I've just found anecdotally throughout my own, especially in my 30s, I found this more. And even honestly, even younger, doing higher rep like sets of squats was good for me. And eventually that translated into just doing like one set of 12 front squats, and that was my squat workout. And so that was, and it was all the way down, just which isn't specific from where the compression hits, but I don't know, it just didn't hurt me. So maybe that has something to do with the eccentric and the yielding element of it.
Yeah, and there's so many ways you can get it. Like you drove a more expansion strategy by stripping the weight back. You can chase heavy weights to an extent while driving a yielding strategy. You just have to stack the deck more to promote that. So really elevating the heels, because elevating the heels is going to put them into more inhalation and more sort of yielding concepts. It's going to give you more range to sort of bend down into it. So you can do it by chasing higher reps with not so much load. You can do it from a biomechanical perspective. You've got so many tools here to drive more expansion or more compression in any context, depending on how you're looking to set it up.
Cool.
So for someone who isn't built to squat, like you say, like doing traditional heavy squats with them with like feet flat on the ground, they're going to have to compress themselves to try to turn that thing into a deadlift, versus elevating their heels, having their hands out in front of them.
Yes.
You're going to give them a lot more leverage to yield, so they're not going to have to compensate on top of that with all this added compression. And they're going to be able to work on genuinely just trying to shoot those guts up vertically rather than just trying to flip them out the front.
Yeah,
so to speak.
One of my favorite training movements for me is a squat clean from blocks with actually stuff under my heels. So I love that. That's like one of my favorite things.
Yeah, and I think weightlifting as well, like it's, we go through these cycles of like loving it or hating it for sports performance, but like I see a lot of like similar sort of qualities there. It's like we've got so many yielding and overcoming actions in the weightlifting movements all sort of rolled into one, which can be very noisy from a programming perspective, but there's an abundance of tools there, I think, in weightlifting.
Yeah. All right. So if I get an athlete and they want to sprint faster, jump higher, whatever, and they're more of a inhale person, so a wide infrasternal angle, basically I just kind of feed more of that engine. Like that athlete can be compressed more, like they can stand some. Yeah. But then how do I tell when? I mean, I think it's easy. Like someone like me, I'm going to start getting compressed quickly. Maybe you just start seeing contact times increase, or maybe you see it show up in their squatting with their low back compressing first. But how do you mentioned a little bit, but how do you like determine, okay, wow, now you're really starting to use compressive strategies to tack on pounds to the bar at this point? Like what are some rules of thumb to just navigate the process, like the day-by-day process of when do we add weight? What am I trying to get this athlete to think of and those types of things?
So many different things, because you can talk about like in the short term and the long term. So like even just short term, talking about in the set, if you're doing squats and like you're going down, then up, down, then up, down, then up, and then usually about rep 7, depending on the intensity that you're working at, the hips go down, then back, and then up. At that point, you're probably no longer driving a yielding strategy. That doesn't mean you have to rack the bar. You just have to know that you're probably no longer driving a yielding strategy at the pelvic floor. So your set halfway has turned into something else. Over the longer term, if it's just at the point where the athlete starts looking different when they're doing the thing that they actually need to do, you've compressed them too much. They no longer have the requisite movement options to express what they need, to express compression through the spaces that they need to compress. So you need to expand them to give them movement options. With your wide muscular driven athletes, as long as they're feeling good, just keep compressing them. You can keep compressing them, letting them lean into their strengths, provided they maintain the movement options. And I usually find that they can tolerate a fair bit of compression. Like the expanded people are real easy to compress, and that they lose movement options quickly. Like they seem more sensitive, whereas the compressed people do seem a little bit more like, you can be much more ham-fisted. Like some of the ways I go for expansion, even when I do expand, my compressed guys, like they're the people where you could slip back into that paradox of trying to drive an expansion strategy, but trying to use a shit ton of weight, like having them just hold on to the pull-up bar and stuff like that for like as long as they can, and like, or, you know, even strapping weight to their feet and things like that. So even then, like, you're always sort of in this paradox. But yeah, so that's sort of an intra-set sort of way you can look at it, and then like a intra-training cycle way you can look at it, be like, okay, this person's lost movement options, let's go into a more expansion-dominant training cycle.
Yeah, I makes me think too about, I don't know if maybe this is just a shortcut, but it was, I think, a powerlifter, Adam Glass, and I think I mentioned this on the show before, maybe at some point, but Dave Delanav, I'm probably saying his last name wrong, Dave Delanav, or I'm probably going to, I could spell it, but anyways, he was talking about, he's got a biofeedback-based deadlift program where like you do a deadlift, and you then do like a toe touch or arm raise behind your head, and you check range of motion, and you use that as your guide to see when your body went into threat. Like, and if you do a set and you add weight and you go and you touch your toes after that set and the range decreased, then your brain, it's almost like your movement options got decreased.
It's staying with you.
Yeah. And so I wonder if that almost would be a way to check your eye as a coach, in the sense of, because I did that program for a little while, and I found like the Jefferson deadlift was actually my best in terms of not, like I could keep doing toe touches with the Jefferson. Maybe it's because I'm like rotate, you know, I can rotate. So my body wants to rotate. Let's do this Jefferson deadlift. And
well, that's just a big ER in the back of the ribcage. It's just a big yield.
I'll have to lift with you sometime. You can explain this.
When the world opens up, I'm coming over to the US. I'll see if I can drag my brother, and I'm coming to train with you, Grant Fowler. I'm going to swing by Pat Davidson's gym. I got a big tour of the States I need to do.
Please
go like crush weights with everyone.
Yeah, well, based off my lifts, I don't know if it's going to be crushing weights, but maybe we'll do what we can.
Dude, I'm in the same boat as you. Some of the strong people that are following me now, it's made me not want to post my own lifts. I'm like, can you guys not watch? I want to upload a deadlift.
Yeah, I mean, you're doing pretty good, man. I'm almost going to get off track with what I was going to ask you. Let's see. Oh, yeah, but the Jefferson deadlift, I found that when it was so minute for me, like and it's taken me years to really get sensitive to what my body's doing. But I remember when I would just put on like 10 more pounds, and then I'd do the lift, couple reps, put it down, and I would decrease in range. And I felt like literally the description of what I did to make myself decrease was a shift. My hips shifted, my low back shifted like a millimeter. That was it. And I would have never noticed it. No one would have noticed it. But it's almost like when the body's shifting the way it's not supposed to, it's like the brain, or you're compressing maybe in your brain more than you should. The brain doesn't like it, and it says, okay, like, and so I don't know. I mean, it would be an interesting test with people at different infrasternal angles and compression levels to see how much a person like me could tolerate. Should I be doing like 2 sets of deadlift, and then I couldn't touch my toes as well, and then the other person's like just crushing, adding weight. And I'd be interesting to see. Tolerance is such a big thing, because I'm
measuring like degrees of freedom lost in a weekly training cycle with each person doing X amount of strength training, and measuring a wide versus narrow response to that would be heaps cool.
Yeah, I've been just we were always biased by our own, stuff. And so I've always been biased towards, all right, let's just definitely go on the lighter side for everybody. And, just don't want to push it. And but there are athletes who can push it a little bit more based off what you're saying. And I know there's, a lot of athletes are like that. And so it's good to
the hedge. I think the hedge is in the weight room chasing expansion because you've got weight. That's going to compress you anyway. So the hedge, I think if you're unsure what to do something, is throw a bit of weight on someone and drive an expansion strategy. You're going to get the strength training benefits, but you're not going to sort of take away too many yielding or movement options.
Expansion strategy, and was that, is that like jumps or is that like what?
Expansion strategy is the inhalation strategy, the squat strategy, the yielding sort of strategy.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha. So compression, deadlift, expansion is like a deep squat.
Yeah, expansion is vertical translation of the pelvis. Hip flexion, abduction, external rotation, all those sorts of things.
Got it. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
All right, so you mentioned posterior chain, and I think we'd have time to hit on this briefly, so I think this kind of fits with what we're talking about. But you had mentioned before the show, I don't even know if I had this on the list to ask you, but I think this would be a nice transition, but you've mentioned that posterior chain training isn't, I think our intentions are good, but when we actually lay our instructions down, we could be setting athletes back. So tell me what you think about training the posterior chain. What have we done to it as an industry, and what is the best way to go about that?
I think we're always training our posterior chain because humans, especially more sedentary humans, we just all fall into that posture of sort of falling forward more. And so we've got this thing where we're chronically training our posterior chain. And I think people go in and they do like acute posterior chain training and they feel a benefit from that. But I don't think the benefit is felt from training the posterior chain. I think it's just felt from the variability of doing something that was sort of like more chronic and low load and then some acute high load. Whereas I think what is more missing, David Gray, I know you talk to him a lot. He's a big fan of giving people what they're missing, especially when they're feeling bad. So just trying to focus a little bit more on that. And getting people to fall backwards and train the opposite almost. And that doesn't switch the posterior chain off. It just changes sort of how it's recruited. Because I think when people are falling forward, pelvis is in that anterior tilt, like you're training back through a shortened position and then your hamstrings through a lengthened position chronically. So even like the idea of like always using that posterior chain, it's like we're usually recruiting segments of that posterior chain in completely opposing strategies as well. So that's why I find it just like not the most clear or useful way of categorizing the exercises, doing anterior chain or posterior chain focus. Like I say, I think you cover it all a bit more comprehensively and you don't treat the human body like a piece of paper if you more just go expansion compression, not anterior posterior. Like I think that sort of falls into that thinking of the whole like 2-to-1 push-pull ratios and all that nonsense where like maybe it's not even that the words are bad, but we've just thrown so much mud on top of them that it's nice to move across to different language where we've got these, shiny new fresh terms, which can be a little bit distracting, but I also think there's a good side to that because, like I said, they don't have all this baggage of things we've laid onto, like what is a squat and sort of what is the posterior chain and, what is a hinge and all that stuff.
Yeah, and I know you were saying before the show, like, if we want, I mean, it is like a chicken or the egg thing. And I always look at, like, what's the source? Like, I was talking about the athletes who can easily squat double body weight. Well, a lot of them just have tremendous neuromuscular outputs. It's not even as much, a little bit of it's their structure, but they're just also wired too. And so someone who doesn't have adequate hamstrings, glute, whatever. Well, it's funny because if your calves are too big, you might be messed up. You know what I'm saying? Like,
my calves are huge, FYI. My hamstrings do no work.
Yeah, I feel like because we say like I fear the person who's got like the lats and the glutes and the hamstrings that but yeah, a lot of people are gonna have pairs. Like my glutes and my calves are pretty good, but my hamstrings need a lot of help, and my back is super my low back is super tight and compressed, and my lats are probably like...
Oh, the idea that back training can't get you in trouble, because that was the narrative that I was bought into. Yeah. It was just seen as this ultimate hedge. Like, no matter what your strength training program looks like, it will be as good or better if you just throw in more posterior chain work. Can't go wrong, right? Strong back. But then you get all these people where like their lats have squeezed all the air out of the back of their rib cage, and then they have absolutely no ability to rotate because they can't expand either side of the back of their rib cage. They cannot get their arms above their head because, again, you need air in the back of the rib cage to give your lats a fulcrum to lengthen over. It's you can get yourself into a lot of bother by emphasizing the posterior chain, and like especially all the things that ride along with it, like downward rotation of the scaps and things like that. Because again, downward rotation of the scaps, we consider that an exhalation or compression movement, and you can see that because it's all your lats just squeeze all the air out of your back, and you go into that extended posture. But then, you know, when you can get those lats lengthened again, open up the back of that rib cage, then you'll notice people can rotate and people can get their arms up above their head, which is, as we know, like really important for a whole bunch of different sports.
And that's it's almost like it's almost like the layers of the industry we're getting closer and closer to the core of things as we're going along. Like before it was the muscles, and now at least we're looking at the bones and pressures and how that impacts what we see with the muscles. And
the bones are the constraints for like the pressure system to flow through. Like they direct all the pressure. I think it was Pat Davidson that sort of used that explanation, which I thought was really good.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm very like, I love this point because I am the epitome of someone who I set my high jump PR when I was 21, which is like, so I should have said it when I was 25 or 28, but what happened to me is I've been weightlifting since I was 12, and it's like, my back gains muscle so easily, by far my most like developed, like body part. And I think a lot of it's just because it's the lifts that I was the best at. I was the best at deadlifting and even Olympic lifts. I was a really strong puller, and I am in a lot of anterior tilt. So I would get a lot of like low back, spinal compression to like facilitate stuff, but that did not help my elastic abilities, and it's extra weight to throw up in the air. So, I mean, I jumped pretty well in but the jumper I was when I was 26, I was jumping 6'10", so like 2 meters 10, almost 209 when I was almost there. But it was like I was 5 kilos more in weight. It was uglier. My standing vertical was better. Like if I was a football player, I would have probably been more fearsome on the football field. But that little ability,
harder to rotate out of the way.
yeah, that little ability was just it was lost, and so I feel like I didn't do right by my posterior chain training. So I'll ask you this question, and this is what would be coming, and rightfully so, is, okay, well, I have an athlete who's quad dominant. Like I have an athlete who doesn't activate their, whatever in the posterior chain very well. I think there's a lot of, different things can be going on back there, but what's your thoughts on how does an athlete become more quad dominant, knee dominant, developing quads too much, and then how do you start to steer them in the other direction rather than just saying, oh, we'll just go hit some hamstring curls and some reverse glute ham and stuff like that?
Yeah, it's just about controlling the center of mass. Like I think we've all seen in a textbook or on those skeleton models, like the shape that a rib cage should be. You've got these alternating curves up your back, and you've got this. It's not shaped like a Coke can, but it's generally round from all the sides. And like what you'll notice is that people who've done a lot of activity or not enough activity, the shape of that changes. You start to lose the curves and stuff like that. And that is going to echo throughout the body distally, right? So like you just don't have a hope in getting your hamstrings to be where you want them to be at the right time unless you have that right shape proximally to orient it all around. Does that make sense? Like if you really flatten out that back, it can't rock around through space so easily. It kind of just like folds in different directions. So if you can just respect that proximal structure for what it is, put your skeleton in a position that just directs airflow and pressure evenly, that is going to help you maintain all your movement options. And then the question of training your hamstrings is a really simple one to answer. It's just like, well, sometimes train them in a long position, sometimes train them in a short position, sometimes train them slow, sometimes train them fast. And just people are always trying to look for these eureka moments with hamstrings. Like you just do this for hamstrings and then you're sweet. And it's just like the answer has always been do everything for your hamstrings. But due to limitations and compensations at our more proximal structures, people are unable to genuinely train their hamstrings through all these positions.
Yeah, like a Nordic hamstring is a go-to, and I believe in Nordics, but I also seen a lot
Me too.
I've seen a lot of athletes basically make a Nordic a low back curl, like
Yes.
drive compression low back and then just hang on for dear life.
And it's meant to be eccentric, right? But people cannot handle the yielding action or the expansion of the hamstring, so they compress something upstairs to help manage the pressure. So I'm like, that's to me like a low bar back squat when you're doing a Nordic like that. It's like we took this beautiful expansion and yielding strategy and you just compressed the hell out of it. So it's not that it's bad, but it's like there was so much potential to head in a direction there, and you managed to sort of stay in no man's land a little bit.
Yeah.
I know we're getting some lengthening of sarcomeres and yada, 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 but
there was the Nordboard team came in back when I was at Cal. They came in for a little bit and just testing stuff out, and I hadn't used it before. I tested it out and I crushed it. Actually, I crushed that Nordboard test, and I swear it's probably because I was really good at compressing my low back. I know it. I'm like, my hamstrings are not that strong. I think I just crushed that. Like, and I don't know. Like, I'm good at connecting my body and just compensating and using those things. I mean, I don't have many hamstring issues for what it's worth either. So I'm not saying it's like, I think what they're doing is probably good, but I mean, I haven't seen any research with it. It seems good. But it was just interesting to me how many people I've seen who utilize that strategy with that movement. Yeah. So I hear
and that's the thing as well. Like, I think we talked about how compression, there's a lot of baggage with that word. And like, I don't know about you, but I feel like compensation gets a similar sort of rap, but it's just like, okay, so like the compensation strategy is like what kind of ruined your expansion strategy and laid all this compression on top of it. But the other side of looking at it is it allowed you to have all this output. So like the idea of a compensation is that there is a reward for the thing you exchange for it. So it's just like making sure you're getting a good deal for your compensations.
Yeah, I wonder too. I mean, I was just doing sprints today, and I just like, again, the more aware you are of your body, that it's like I can feel, compared to, I think, if I was playing a team sport where everything's on autopilot, but I'm just running like 150s and 200s, and I can literally like feel myself trying to grip my toes a little bit to push a little further each stride.
Yeah.
And I'm like, this is not normal. I think I'm just like, it's like you realize that you're kind of compensating a little bit to artificially increase your stride length and stuff like that.
For people like you, especially, are you familiar with the phases of propulsion? How it's like ER, IR, ER, like late propulsion with expanded axial skeleton. Obviously, that biases you into ER, and then you like to be on the balls of your feet. And so, like, you're probably constantly in that sort of toe-off position, which is that sort of like concentric ER. So, like, that's sort of how some people do find like a sneaky sort of compression strategy over the top of that overall inhaled skeleton and stuff.
I've heard like everyone in Pat's book, he talks about, Davidson's like, everyone compensates. Your grandma compensates. Usain Bolt compensates. Like, there's all
this. And they're very different.
I like that, because I do think it's easy to, like, especially the more you know about this stuff, it's like, oh, you're doing this compensation strategy, and maybe it is good to come around full circle and be like, look, like, everyone does a compensation. It's just, I think, to know when and how that compensation is going to produce results that aren't very helpful for you is a really valuable skill.
Yeah. And it all comes back to our insecurity. Like, I think people are like, oh, you're compensating. And instantly, even I'm like, no, don't say that. But I'm like, oh, wait. All right. Am I getting a good compensation here? Like, you've just got to have that, like, try to not have a knee-jerk. We all need to try to not have a knee-jerk reaction to these words and try to be more calm and try to just see the words and the joint actions that they describe just for what they are, I guess.
Yeah. And so back with the hamstring, because I do want to kind of close this out, is I think about, maybe I'll use me as an example, and a lot of people are in this boat, people who have a lot of like low back compressive, like they really round their low back out to do like a hinge. And does that rounding, where it's almost like a seesaw, it's almost like on one side's your low back, on the other side of the pelvis is your hamstrings. And if you're tipped towards your low back, like your low back is going to develop and your hamstrings won't as much. Is it kind of like as simple as that? Or
those people are probably unable to expand at that area of the body, so they're just expanding all through the lower back.
Okay.
You know what I mean? Because they're trying to expand their pelvis. They're not getting it as much as they want, so it's just all expanding and externally rotating through the lower back and the lower rib cage.
Got it. So that's why someone who is like elastic, highly like just like a bouncing ball, that where they're going to get
it's easy for them to expand there.
Yeah, that's just it's easy for you to expand in the hinge in the low back versus being able to really fill the pelvis out all the way to the bottom and then get the hamstrings more involved.
Because it's a lot of coordination to keep that pelvis over the pelvic diaphragm and drive those guts down into it to expand the pelvis. That's what drives the expansion. Just your guts sitting in there. Whereas a lot of the time people can't handle that pressure because your body just wants to stop you from falling over and peeing your pants. And I think a lot of people don't realize that a lot of their posture is just their body trying to make them not pee their pants. So they're just like, oh, these guts is a lot of work to hold on the pelvic floor. I'm just going to flip it out the front of my pelvis and I don't have to manage that pressure anymore. I'll just wail on my back.
I remember one of the throwers I used to work with when I was a strength coach back at Cal. It was one of the first years I was there, and this guy was like a fire plug. Like he was 6 foot, barely over 200 pounds, and threw 62 feet or really far. And I was jealous because he'd do squats, back squats, and be like, "Oh man, my hamstrings are so sore from those squats." I was like, I wish mine were. Yeah, I wish it was not my quads and my low back, my back achy and all that stuff. So in that situation, someone who does squat or back squat and feels their hammies, they're able to really expand space in their pelvis all the way down.
Well, and the amount of work your hamstrings, because your hamstrings when you're right around parallel in that squat, I bet this guy wasn't going crazy deep. No. The hamstrings are trying to pull that pelvis into extension and ascend that pelvic floor and throw the guts up off it. They're a part of that sort of system as well. So it's crazy when you can keep your pelvis under you and get down to halfway in that squat, how much people will feel those inferior glute fibers and proximal hamstring and stuff like that.
Gotcha. Does everyone have the capacity to feel hamstrings like that in squat, or only people who are wider ISAs more likely than not?
You will have to elevate heels for a lot of people.
Oh, gotcha.
So, sorry, just squatting with your body weight, absolutely not. It's going to be really hard for a lot of people to manage that position. But with heel wedges, just open up everything. You know what I mean? People are falling forward. You just make them fall forward even more. And then they're like, whoa. And they react to it and they pull themselves back. When it comes to just pushing and pulling people forwards or backwards, the heel wedges just open up all the possibilities.
Yeah. I know we could talk about this forever. And the heel wedge stuff has been a huge game changer for me, but I know we're out of time for the day. I guess it just flew by, but thank you so much for taking time to answer my questions and analyze me. So I appreciate it, man. I
appreciate you. I hate the way that we all get pushed to sort of stay in our lanes in this S&C and fitness realm. And I get sick of talking. I love talking to powerlifters and stuff like that, anyone who will sort of entertain my opinions. But I'm so thankful that someone from outside the strength sports space has wanted to have these chats because I benefit from it as well. It's really nice to sort of hear some different thoughts and perspectives. And yeah, absolute honor to be invited on the show.
Yeah, well, thank you again. Yeah, that intermixing of different, jumping, track, and powerlifting, and the, just good conversation between. I think there's so much good that comes out of it. So it's really great talking to you. Thanks for tuning in for another show. Glad to have you guys here. And man, that was a fun show with a lot of in-depth information. I think I might have set a record in my note-taking and show notes. So be sure to check those out as well. If you enjoyed the show, you can head over to iTunes, Stitcher, whatever you're listening to, and leave us a rating or review. I'd really appreciate it. We'll see you guys next week with another great guest.